Hello there and welcome to the Astranti Top 10 Most Likely Unseen Issues for the Operational Case Study exam of February 2019, where the company we are looking at is Trigg Adventure. And in this video, I will be talking about and discussing the top 10 most likely issues that I think are going to come up in the exam in February. So let me tell you a little bit about the basis of my choices for these top 10 issues. So one of the key aspects that has led me to deciding on these top 10 issues is the prominence of that issue in the pre-scene based on the pre-scene analysis that I've done. And I did a series of 6 videos where I analyzed the pre-scene in detail. You should be able to find those. And basically, having done that analysis, there is certain space given to issues in the pre-scene. Maybe it's a number of pages or just a significant section, or there's a degree of importance attached to it by the examiner. So the thing with the pre-scene, you have to think about the fact that CIMA have produced this pre-scene with the idea of having exam questions ready to examine that particular pre-scene. So what they'll do is put things into it that they've already got an exam question planned for. So for example, if you put in, an email from the director that talks about an acquisition of a toy company, like we have in this case, then that suggests to me that an acquisition is quite a likely exam topic. And it's deliberately been put in there because CIMA intend to use that as a scenario for some exam question. But that's not the only thing, just the prominence in the pre-scene. That's one consideration. But we also have to think about the strategic importance of some issues. Now, another video I did was the strategic analysis video. And what we did in that video was came up with a business strategy for the company. And a key part of that was doing an in-depth SWOT analysis of the company, and that helped us to come up with a business strategy going forwards. Now, this is my strategy, something I've come up with, but I think it's fairly accurate, and this will inform the kind of decisions and things that the company wants to be doing going forward. So in this case, it's something that will be on the mind of the directors. We've come up with this strategy. This is something the company wants to do over the next 12 months, and so it's quite likely that things in that strategy will come up in the exam as well. In addition to that, I have quite a lot of experience with past exams. I always review the exams that come out. I've been recording these videos and dealing with operational case study for more than 2 years now. I know quite a lot about what to expect in exams, the kind of things that are easy to examine from an examiner's perspective, what things are more difficult to examine and thus less likely to appear in the exam. Some issues are fairly typical. They come up again and again and again, so they're likely to come up again in the future. The more common issues I'll mention as we go through. There's another consideration as well, and I've sort of touched upon this, but it relates to how easy it is to write issues on a particular subject. Certain things are very easy to write topics on. For example, break-even analysis is a very common topic that comes up in many exams because it's quite easy to examine. It is not as easy to examine in the operational case study, at least, something like the regulation of financial reporting. That doesn't tend to come up in the OCS. That is examined more just in the F1 objective test paper. So what can you do with this information once I've given it to you? When I've told you the top 10 issues, what use is that to you? Well, one of the key things you can do is prepare key models from the pre-scene information. Okay, so I've already talked about SWOT, but there are a whole range of models that could be relevant here. You might want to use PESTLE, you might want to use Porter's value chain, you might want to use more specific models relating to marketing or supplier chain management. All those kind of things might be relevant, and you can apply those models based on the pre-scene information before going into your exam to give you a rough idea of the kind of issues that could come up in your exam. But the key there is, if you've prepared a model based on pre-scene information, that's fine, that's the first step, but you must adapt that model for any new information that comes out in the unseen. The unseen is just another word for the exam. So when you get to the exam and you've perhaps done a SWOT analysis, new information comes out in the exam and the new threat has been identified, then make sure you update your SWOT analysis to include this additional threat. Another thing you can do is practice mock exams that cover these issues. Now, we do produce mock exams. We produce 3 full mock exams at the operational level. We also have a mini mock, and those exams are written based on the key issues identified in this video. So there's a good chance that if you do one of our mock exams, there'll be quite a lot of overlap with those and the actual exams that you sit in February. We cannot make any guarantees on that, but we do our best to identify the most likely issues, and we write our exams around that. Another thing you could do and should be doing is finding relevant real life examples. So what we mean by that is showing wider industry understanding. Another product we offer is the industry analysis. We have a video for that, and we have a 100-page pack, which is essentially looking at the real life industry that we're dealing with in this particular case. So it's children's toys, in particular outdoor play equipment. We've got a pack that looks in depth at that industry, and what we have at the end of that pack is 25 real life examples that align with the top 10 issues that you could use in the exam, because the examiner does like to see that you have wider industry knowledge, and you show that by including a paragraph here and there showing that you know what's going on in the industry. So if it's something to do, for example, with sourcing of timber, then you could use a real life example that talks about what's going on in the world of timber. Maybe it's the cost of raw materials or certain issues there, and there's a lot more of information about that in the industry pack, and I highly recommend checking that out. So what you can do there is prepare sample paragraphs for certain issues. So like I said, if it's a sourcing issue, you can have a paragraph in mind for that particular concern, and you can more or less learn them as you go into the exam. So if you get a question on sourcing, you have already at least one paragraph that shows the examiner you have wider industry knowledge, and they are usually quite impressed by that. Something else you can do is learn the typical key points. So the advantages or disadvantages of certain models, certain approaches, certain methods. An obvious example here would be costing or budgeting. You can learn the typical key points, advantages of marginal costing or the disadvantages of marginal costing, maybe the advantages of activity-based costing. Remember to apply it to the scenario. So some of them will be generic, some of them will depend on specific information about the company and the industry and etc. And one final point here is to be prepared for which models to use to support the issue. So for each issue, I will suggest theory or models that are relevant and could help you in answering a question on that issue. So if you get a question, for example, on competitor analysis, then a good model you might use there is Pestle. So you know which models are relevant for certain issues. So all of these things should, these are all of the things that this video should enable you to do. And ultimately, this just puts you in a much stronger position, and you'll feel much more prepared when you come to sit this exam in February. And remember, the pass rates for the OCS exam at the time of this recording, at least, are around about 50% for first-time takers. So there's a 50-50 chance that anyone taking the exam for the first time will pass or will fail. And the more you can do to prepare yourself for this exam, the more you can sort of alleviate the stress and worry of not knowing what's going to come up in the exam, the more you increase your chances of passing. So you'll be in that 50% who does pass the exam. Okay, so let's get on with the issues then, shall we? Let's get on with the point of this video. So the first one we're going to look at, and they are listed in numerical order starting from 10, but that doesn't relate to any order of importance. We're not saying that issue 10 is less likely than issue 1. They just happen to be in this particular order. So issue number 10 is acquisition. Now, as many of you will know, acquisition is a key F1 topic, and for some of you, so as we should know, acquisition is a key F1 topic. Business combinations and acquisitions and all that sort of stuff was a pretty big deal in the F1 paper, and so it's an important one to potentially examine at the operational level. And specifically focusing on what we've seen in the pre-scene, there is literally a full page that is talking about this company called Safari Toys, and Tony Trigg, the managing director, seems to be very keen on potentially acquiring Safari Toys. So, I mean, that's about as clear as it gets when it comes to identifying an exam issue. But in addition to that, that's one way we could go with acquisition. I think another potential area would be in groundworks. We know that this is the last remaining part of the company's sort of operations that they are outsourcing to third parties, and they could bring this in-house. They would have control over that whole process, but bringing it in-house, the most likely way that they'll be able to do that would be to make an acquisition of a company that already specializes in groundworks. So the way that acquisition is likely going to be examined will be some sort of proposal to invest. We've already seen the proposal in a way for Safari Toys. So the next step, what you might get in the exam, is more information about Safari Toys. Maybe you'll get some key ratios or some key financial information, some more detailed facts and figures about the company. And what you'll do is sort of analyze that, evaluate that information, and potentially make a recommendation on whether or not to invest in Safari Toys. It might be further on down the line. It might be that the company has already decided to make an acquisition. And the question is, what is the impact of the company of creating an associate or a subsidiary or whatever kind of entity or whatever group will be created from this particular acquisition? So if you do get an acquisition question, here are some things that you need to talk about. So for one, of course, this all depends on what the specific requirement of the question is, but you would probably be talking about the impact of producing financial statements. And so when you're talking about acquisitions, business combinations, there are certain techniques to accounting for that, certain standards that we need to use that help us to make consolidated accounts effectively. So what you might be asked to do is talk about how the acquisition of a subsidiary at some sort of ownership percentage would impact the company's ability to produce consolidated accounts, and what that would mean for, you know, the reserves, or how we would combine net assets and those sorts of questions. It might be a more general question about the impact on the business organization, and what you would talk about there then is from a more of a business perspective, the conjoining of two different companies, potentially with different cultures, different goals, how to get goal congruence between these two entities, how they're going to be managed, maybe that kind of more of that approach rather than the technical accounting approach. You might want to talk about diversification and how the acquisition of a company relates to diversification. If it is diversification, obviously for Safari Toys, that would count as pretty strong diversification. If it was the acquisition of a groundworks company, that might be less, hardcore diversification. That might be more to do with completing the, the full range of, or the full amount of operations that the company can do. So here's the theory you should be using. Where if it's more accounting focused questions, you're obviously going to be looking at business combinations. For group accounting, financial reporting, so the relevant standards there, all those different, all that different theory you looked at with, the group income statement, the group statement of financial position, accounting for associates. Also the other side of it, where you create your own separate financial statements in addition to group statements, what the exemptions are for those sort of things. You might be using organizational structure more if that's impacted by the acquisition, and how we can join these two companies, how we integrate this new company into the existing company. That relates to human resource management as well. So if we're taking on extra staff, well, it depends on the nature of the acquisition, but if we are bringing staff in-house, if it's more of a merger, then there's going to be a human resource requirement to that. And what you might want to mention is the fact that human resources at the moment is sort of managed on an ad hoc basis by the finance manager, and if we do take on more staff, that's going to be an increased burden for Ping, the finance manager. And so we may need to, in addition, look at setting up a dedicated HR team. There might also be some scope to do ratio analysis if indeed the question is the early stages and you're still looking at the potential or the possibility of acquiring a company, and before you make a decision, there might be some kind of ratio analysis question, and that would be a good way to bring in some of your F1 knowledge. Okay, the next issue is risk assessment. So risk is a key part of the P1 syllabus, and it breaks down into a number of different areas as well. So risk identification, how to measure risk, the different ways of doing that, different techniques. Also risk assessment, and also coming into this as well, not just risk, but also decision making in response to risk, and how to control risk. It's something that's regularly examined, recently examined. It comes up a lot because it's kind of a general enough area. Risk is kind of applicable to almost any scenario, and so it's fairly easy for an examiner to come up with a risk-based question. And usually the way that risk is examined is the identification of key risks in a specific project. So if there's a new project being undertaken, maybe it's an acquisition, maybe it's new product development, maybe it's new departments being set up, whatever it might be. There are obviously going to be key risks involved in that new project, and your role in the exam would be to identify those risks, potentially suggesting measures for risks and ways of controlling those risks. It might be measuring risk in a particular area of the business. So rather than a specific project, it might be looking at, managing risk, maybe sort of verging into, internal audit sort of territory. So there are some key risks outlined in the pre-scene, and there are many more risks than this, but these are the key ones. And remember, this is the top 10 most likely issues, so I'm just going to focus on the most salient ones. Of course, the company has experienced decreasing revenues. Now, this is partly due to the domestic market being in a maturity phase, but we can't entirely blame it on the external market. Some of this is down to the company as well. We know that profitability is decreasing, and that's an issue with the company. And if both of these things continue, the company is going to be in real trouble. They have a limited product range and thus limited, options for customers. That's a risk for them because it's a very competitive market, and having such a limited range just means you've got less to offer the market. There's also the rising, that says risking, it should say rising popularity of digital toys. This is a key focus in the pre-scene. It's a key reason why the domestic market is in maturity, because digital toys and electronic toys have taken over. They're highly addictive, and most children prefer to use these now instead of going outside and having to go on a swing or playing on a slide. And I can't imagine why. And So those are some key risks outlined in the pre-scene, but there's additional points as well. So risk management, risk identification is important at operational level, and we need to understand the importance of risk management at operational level. It's not just a strategic concern or consideration. Risk management, identification and control should be enforced at all levels of the organization. And also you're going to want to raise the point of how to control a risk. So if you've identified a risk, you would probably want to go and suggest a way that that risk could be mitigated or minimized, if not completely removed in its entirety. So do explain how your control will manage the risk as well. So you suggest a control and you say specifically, my control or this way of minimizing this would be to do this, and this would have the impact of X, Y, and Z. So that's the kind of structure you would want to give to an answer on this topic. Okay, so theory you can use related to risk assessment and also, as I've said, decision making. The key one for me is decision trees. I've not seen an OCS exam sitting that didn't have at least some question on decision trees. So this is almost guaranteed to come up in one of the 5 variants. But more generally about risk, there are, of course, the theory relating to attitudes to risk. So the risk attitude, the risk tolerance, understanding what the company's risk attitude and tolerance is. For Trigg, we would say perhaps that they, up until recently, have been fairly conservative, fairly risk averse, but now Tony Trigg has come aboard and he seems to be quite willing to take risks in order to grow the company. There's also risk-based decisions and how your attitude to risk might influence the way you make decisions. And there's different ways of doing that. So maxi min, maxi max, mini max regret, those different approaches, ways of either minimizing losses or maximizing gains, or maxi max, mini max regrets is the way of minimizing the regret you might have for a decision you take that goes badly. So that's key theory that if you're not familiar with it or you can't quite remember the specifics, go back, hit your P1 study text, and make sure you are prepared for those topics. So just before we finish, I'd like to take you through some of the products we offer in the entire case study course. So this is just one element of the whole course, and I'll just go through the other things that we offer here. So to start with, we have a study text that is devoted to the operational case study, and that's split into two parts. The first part is a guide to how to pass the case study exam. It's full of exam tips, exam strategy, time management, preparation and planning, how to write to the marking criteria, all those kinds of things. And then part two of that study text is a condensed version of all the relevant material of the kind of things that come up in the exam over and over. So essentially it's the most popular topics that have come up in past exams from E1, P1 and F1. And so those are the two study texts available for the operational case study course. And we also do course videos that are roughly based around that first study text. So the exam advice and the timing, the planning, all the things that go in to preparing an exam strategy. We have an entire series of videos that go through that in detail. So if you're more of a visual learner rather than a reader, you can check those out and they'll be a great help in getting you past the exams. The pre-scene analysis is the series of 6 videos where we look through the actual pre-scene in minute detail, going through every paragraph, making notes and looking how we can use this information to better prepare for the exam when the exam comes up. Separate from that is an industry analysis, and that is a document and a video as well. So the two are in tandem, and the document is about 100 pages looking at the industry in which the company exists. So for example, if the case company is in the car and they're a car manufacturer, then the industry analysis would be an analysis of the car industry. And that's like I say, that's a large document where we break it down, and we're essentially, the point of that is we're doing the research for you to save you time and energy. And the really great thing about the industry analysis is that we include 25 industry examples at the end. So things that happened in the real industry. So the example I just used, it being the car industry. If we were doing the car industry, we'd take 25 examples from the car industry of relevant news and things that have happened to companies and to the industry and consumers or whatever it is. As when we get from those 25 examples, we write a little exam paragraph, the kind of thing that you can literally rehearse and put it in your exam if it's relevant. Examiners do like to see that you have a wider industry knowledge, and so putting in a little example like that can get you good marks. We do mock exams. For the operational case study, we write 3 mock exams, and we have a free mini mock that you can do that are based on the actual CIMA style case study. So they're computer based, they're online, and they're timed, and it's as close to the real thing as we can possibly make it. And that's a really good way to prepare you for the exam. Each time we write our questions based on the pre-scene that's just been released. And with those mock exams, you can get marking and feedback, and that's really essential for you to, if you do your mock exams, I would recommend also getting marking and feedback, because you can then see where you went wrong or what you did well. And the feedback allows you to improve on that. Really important part that a lot of students skip over, and they really struggle in the exam because they weren't prepared, they hadn't done the mock exams. We have masterclasses that run over a course of 2 separate weekends, running up to the exam, and they're essentially a live online class webinar where our tutor will go through with you the kind of a revision one where we're recapping on the most important topics from the E1, P1 and F1 syllabus, and one will be sort of more exam focused. And then finally, we offer pass guarantee, which means that if you meet all the requirements, so you use all these all these different products that are available, and you fill in a checklist to say that you've done those, but you still don't pass your exam, you're unfortunate or whatever, then we will allow you to reset our course, to take our course again at no extra charge. That's really great for people who are perhaps taking it for the first time and they don't quite pass, but they need to take the course again. If you've gone through that scheme and you've done everything that we ask you to do, then we'll give you the course again for free.